Thank you very much. What a lovely warm welcome as well, and lovely to see many familiar faces and names joining us this afternoon. So I don't want to take up too much of our tight time, but I guess it comes to me first to say a thank you for coming to the launch of the book. A special thanks to my amazing co-editor Divine, who we will hear from shortly. It's been an absolute joy and a pleasure to learn from him and work with him on the book. And to our marvellous authors and contributors. I think there was something like 27 of them. You've got a small handful of those with you today. So the plan for the time we have got together is to hear from those contributors who are here around two core questions that I posed to them and asked them to prepare a very brief response to. So I asked them to think about, what does social justice mean to psychological therapists? And what does social justice informed psychological practice look like? They might respond to one or both of those questions. I gave them only 3 minutes, so we will see where we get to in those discussions. I initially tried to get Divine to do the opening words, and he suggested it might better come from me. Before I hand over to Divine and the authors, I guess what I need to say and I want to say is something about where the book came from and what we are aiming to do and hope to do with it. It's felt like a long time coming for me. It's been something I've wanted to do and to produce for a number of years. I can see a number of my previous trainees in the room, and I think you'll have heard me talking about this for a number of years. I think the book comes from all of our experiences as individuals, as people, as human beings, our experiences as trainers, some of us, as practitioners, as service users, and as writers. And I think what it's not is a how-to. So this isn't a book on how to do social justice. That's not something we could do or wanted to do. But instead, it's about all of us, I guess, with our complex, messy, intersectional identities, addressing the political, the reflexive, and the ethical nature of social justice in our work. And we wanted to make that clear throughout the text. Divine and I talk about some kind of core principles underpinning social justice informed work, but really we wanted those kind of principles running through the text, not just about what we do in the therapy room, but also beyond. So thank you to everyone. That's all I'm going to say for now, and I'm going to hand over, I think, at this point to Divine, if you want to say a quick something before we ask people to consider those questions.
Thank you, Laura. You've been an amazing colleague to work with and editor, and that's part of the reason I wanted you to go first, because the vision, what you hadn't said is kind of the vision that you had. Initially, we're going to do this a year before, and then the passion for it was reignited. So the first things I'd like to say is thank you, Laura. Thank you to colleagues at Sage, and to all the authors and online events. Thank you, John and Mick, and Sandra and Sebastian for today. And all the authors who contributed, some of whom we're going to hear from just very shortly. And my colleagues at York St. John University, we have social justice at the heart of what we do. And I think my mum and dad are somewhere in the audience. And I wanted to say thank you to them, because they taught me a lot from being a child, really, about civil rights, about the tensions in apartheid South Africa at one time, about refugees and asylum seekers, but really about social justice. So it's something that has been close to my heart. And I also want to thank many colleagues who are here who've written about social justice for a very long time. I could see Colin is here, I could see Mick Cooper's here, and others, Martin and others, and Dwight and others. We really are standing on the shoulders of giants. You know, this work is work of collaboration and allyship. And to end, I'd just like to read, I think that's the right thing to do at a book launch. I'd like to read just from the first chapter that myself and Laura did as one of the other chapters. And this is from Bell 2016, it's on page 4, and it's a definition of social justice, which I think in the times that we're living in the world today, for me, really speaks to my heart. And it says, the goal of social justice is full and equal participation of people from all social identity groups in society, in a society that is mutually shaped to meet their needs. The process of attaining the goal of social justice should also be democratic and participatory. And I think the next bit so speaks true to me in the times we're living in, respectful of human diversity and group differences, and inclusive of affirming human agency and capacity for working collaboratively with others to create change. So with that, Laura, I'll hand back because I'd so love to hear other colleagues speak. And I just say thank you all for attending and celebrating with us here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Divine. I think at this point we're going to Silva to hear Silva's 3 minutes.
Hello, thank you for inviting me. My name is Silva. I am a queer therapist and I work with marginalized clients, mostly queer people, sex workers, and survivors of conversion practices. Social justice means a lot to me on an individual basis, but also as a practitioner. My chapter is on sexuality, and that's also the specialization I have in my practice. And sexuality is an important part of our identities, but it is also political. Much of my clients' distress is in society's oppression, in imposing norms on our sexuality. And so a big part of the work that I do is helping clients in identifying that their distress is not in their self, that they're not broken inside, but that they are shamed and oppressed by society. And it's a good place to start in therapy, but it's also what is embedded in the therapy that I offer throughout the work. In my writing and teaching, I enjoy promoting the idea that thriving as a queer person is not only an individual goal, but it is also a political act of defiance in sexual freedom. And embracing queer joy for ourselves is the best defense against sexual oppression. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Silva. I always want to jump in at this point. I have things to say, but I'm not going to say them. I'm going to hand straight over to our next contributor, Mariam, if you want to say a few words.
Yes, hi. It's a pleasure to be here. And I think this aspect of social justice in counselling and psychotherapy started really on my personal journey too. After I finished my training, I was the first woman of colour to set up a counselling psychotherapy practice in Bradford City Centre, thriving practice. However, although it's great to be the first, it still kind of raises questions in terms of representation, equity, and fairness. And I guess one of the challenges is this idea of, so what does social justice practice look like for professionals or trainees, counsellors and psychotherapists? I think the heart of social justice for me is about empowerment. So we often talk about client empowerment through autonomy in counselling and psychotherapy, but framing it in a model of liberation psychology, which is chapter 7 in this wonderful book, we're looking at framing autonomy in a way where we're restoring autonomy when autonomy is lost in the face of injustice. So when a client's sense of dignity, self-worth and integrity is lost with experiences of injustice. And how do we do that? So I turn to page 81 of our wonderful chapter in this book, wonderful book. So framed in a perspective of liberation psychology, when we're talking about client autonomy and achieving clients' autonomy, we're encouraging the client to really free themselves and liberate themselves through any internal narratives of oppression that they may be feeling. So according to Martin Barrow, to liberate someone, psychologists themselves must also work on the need to liberate themselves on a personal level. Therefore, racially minoritized clients must become more aware of their own racism, oppression and victimization, and recognize their own cultural and indigenous health practices. So what we're really saying is, in order to work with social justice, psychologists and psychotherapists must free themselves of any patterns of oppression that they may be experiencing to work better to promote internal liberation for the client too. Is that my 3 minutes? I could go on if you like.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I want people to go on, but I am going to keep us moving, and we can always come back to people a little later on if we do have time. Who's next on my list? I think Mick, you're next on my list.
Thank you, Laura. I wanted to just start with something actually that I saw on Twitter, as all wise things are, which was a comment about, actually it was an interview with John and our John. And if you haven't seen the podcast, John talking about social justice, John Wilson, do have a listen to it because it's fantastic. But it was somebody saying that the therapy field seems to be splitting, and it was quite a critical Twitter. It was somebody kind of saying that there's all these people going off doing social justice, and then there's the kind of, not the real therapist, but they were saying there's the kind of traditional therapists who are still doing the work of therapy, and then you've got the people who are all woke and doing stuff around social justice. I've been thinking about that a lot recently, because I think that, I don't know about a split, but there is certainly a movement, and it's been a big change in the last 10 years or so, 15 years in the UK, towards recognising, acknowledging the importance of social justice and factors like racism, homophobia, working with difference, and how that really integrates into our therapeutic work. In America, they've done some really brilliant work on things like the multicultural competencies that are just so useful guides to how to practice in a way that's informed by these issues. And I guess I think that probably rather than there being a split between an either or, there is a kind of spectrum about how much people see social justice issues as coming into what we do as counsellors, and how much we can then respond to it and how relevant it is to us. I guess the way that I would see it is that, because one of the kind of criticism from the anti-woke people is that it's all about, you know, do you really just see things in terms of class and race and ethnicity and cultural groups? And I don't think it's that anybody would say that that's the only thing, but I think in the same way that we would understand clients in terms of their past and what's happened in their childhood, for instance, or in terms of their current relationships, more and more, I think what many of us are recognizing, and certainly very much based on the evidence and what the data says, that issues like racism, homophobia, sexism, patriarchy, these all play very evidentially clear factors in people's mental health and well-being. And that to understand what's going on for clients, we need to understand these factors, to not do so, to not be aware of the role that, for instance, racism can play, or homophobia can play, or anti-Semitism can play, is to deny a really important set of factors. It's almost as if you would practice without recognizing that the past, a client's past, also influences their life. So I don't think that, you know, it's easy to characterize the so-called kind of woke therapists as just focused on social justice, but I don't think it's about being focused only on one set of factors. It's about recognizing that every client that comes to us has different things that influence them to be the way that they are, and injustices can play a really major part of that. That's not to say that we're always able to address that and work with that. Just like, you know, we might be working with a client where it's really obvious that issues around sleep or diet have a role to play, and maybe that's not our area of expertise. But I think having the competencies to recognize the impact that social justice and injustice can play in a client's life, and being aware of who might be able to work with that, how they might be able to work with that. In the States, they have a lot of work now on advocacy, is a really important set of competencies that I don't think that can be pushed to the margins anymore. And the development in the US now, they talk about things like social justice being the fifth major force in the counselling field. And I hope that we'll move in that direction where it's fundamentally integrated in the work that we do.
Thank you very much, Mick. Who's next on my list? Dwight, you're next on my list. If we could come to you.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Laura. So thank you to Laura and Divine for inviting me to get involved with this book. It's an absolute pleasure to be invited to draft the chapter. My chapter's on supervision. I thought I'd leave some of my esteemed colleagues to write some of the more important chapters I write about supervision later on. For those of you who don't know my work is very much embedded within social justice. As you know, as Mick has talked about, you know, if I had my T-shirt, if I worked out what it was going to say, I would have worn my "I'm woke" T-shirt this afternoon, because that's one of the things that, you know, I'm quite happy to own that label. It's, you know, this sits very much to my work, because I understand that we are all molded by varying things, family and culture, whatever else, but that those systems as well are very much informed by the political and other aspects which actually oppress us in some ways. So how I view social justice within the psychotherapeutic world is that actually our clients come in to do the work along with us, I should say, or alongside us, not just to heal from depression or whatever else, but to also understand how the systems which mold us, such as patriarchy, white supremacy, capitalism, how they mold and actually create some of the things that we're actually that underpin our malaises. That makes sense. Now, my chapter though is on supervision. And one of the things that I recognized when I was writing the chapter was that actually the role of a supervisor as being like a real sort of guide for the therapist, if you like, to help them look at something that Marianne talked about earlier on, about helping the therapist look at their own internalized oppressors, not just one, maybe others as well, look at where those sort of lie within the psyche, so they can actually assist and aid their clients to work with those aspects within their worlds as well. So it's another layer. It doesn't mean that as supervisors we don't have their own work to do, because we're all molded by these things. They do as well. But it's that extra layer of, okay, how can I help my client, therapist, dyad to actually do the work around these social constructed ideas about who one is and who one isn't. So that's the framework that I built my chapter upon. And it's one of those sort of areas I'm actually quite keen to get to do more work around. So, and that's, I think, enough from me.
Thank you very much, Dwight. And it's one of our chapters that moves beyond the therapy room as well, which is useful to kind of to note and as we think about some of the bigger picture. Martin, you're next on my list.
Great. Hi everybody. Okay, so with the questions, I suppose I narrowed it slightly to what is social justice for, as you say, for psychological therapists. And actually, I'm so looking forward to diving into this more, because, yeah, for me, it's not really completely defined. It's always an ongoing, evolving, moving thing along with the way we understand all kinds of things. So I'm really keen to see how things have developed amongst colleagues. But it got me thinking that, you know, years ago I wrote a piece in CPR, Counseling Psychology Review, where I mused on the point of why do we get involved in this? Because I think that question needs to be answered, because would I talk to my dentist about politics? And if I did, to what end? Probably just to stop him doing any work, rather than actually wanting his input, wanting him to assist. And I do think that that question kind of calls for a nuanced response, because it's situated in so many different contexts, as people have already kind of mentioned. Having said that, I don't think it's not relevant is a position we can adopt. And that's not just because of any position I take or colleagues have kind of put forward so far. I just don't think it stands up to scrutiny. Because if nothing else, understanding how we and our clients came to be the beings that we are today is always informed, as Mick just pointed to, you know, by the past and the future, by the individual, by the familial, and the societal, the context. So I think I'm pleased that there's a movement, and many psychs and counselling and psychotherapists are giving up that idea of what's wrong with you and how can I help, and moving on to something about what's happened to you and how can I help. Because I think that's a really important kind of shift and empowerment and agency. And I think it allows for historical, intimate trauma, as well as societal trauma across the lifespan. In terms of what psychological therapy then looks like, it may or may not mean, I think, that we have to change significantly what we do in therapy with a specific client in therapy. For some people, the kind of supportive insight that we've been doing may be exactly what's needed. But if we get stuck in that, and if we assume that that's the same for everybody, then I think it's problematic. And as people have already said, you know, advocacy is an important thing. Moving beyond the consulting room is an important thing. Taking part in challenging assumptions, all it kind of takes a really important dimension to this kind of work. And at the base of it, I think, is kind of naming things. So naming discrimination, naming oppression, even if we're wrong, even if the client doesn't see it that way, being able to, in an attuned way, actually, I should say, if we just go rambling in and kind of tractor over people's experience, this is bullying or this is racism, that can sometimes create difficulties. But actually, if we can do it in an attuned way, I think that's crucial. I think that's really, really important. And that's where it kind of reflects the point that you were talking about, Laura, becomes really important. Like, how attuned am I here? How much do I kind of understand the context? How am I being defensive or not defensive? All comes into this. And I think I'll leave it there.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Martin. Anne, I think you're next on my list.
Hello, I'm Anne Burgraff, and I've written a chapter in the book about social justice informed practice with refugees. My, I guess, passion for justice, if you like, started many years ago when I was in Canada. And as a teenager, about the age of 16 or 17, I read a book called The Poverty Wall. And it's the first time and only time I actually was so angry at reading a book, I threw it across the wall. And it was about the oppression of the Indigenous people in Canada and the children taken from their homes and put in boarding schools. And so that was a major factor for me to see how these things happen in the world. And a personal quest has been to understand what makes human beings flourish. And what are the external factors? And studying psychology, a lot of it was about, what happens within a person. Now, I'm a systemic therapist, but which I think theoretically can cope with issues of justice, socially, legally, perhaps more effectively than many individual-orientated psychotherapies. So for me, social justice informed psychotherapy begins with the recognition of the integrity of the whole person in all their diversity. Humans are complex. We have many dimensions to us. We are biological, physical. We sense, we imagine, we think, we feel. We make things, we make decisions. And so there is that entire richness, and often psychological modalities focus on one aspect. And so for me, it's about having that understanding of the multi-aspectual nature of being humans, and that each person has a worldview, a way of understanding life, a narrative about the world, about their personal lives, how they make sense of it, which may be different from the therapist. So any therapy that doesn't engage with someone's understanding of the world or focuses exclusively on one mode while ignoring the rest is by its nature reductionistic. So it means that as a therapist, to be social justice informed is to have an awareness of this multiplicity, even if it's not the focus of the therapy. It also requires that understanding as we've talked about the cultural and systemic context in which you are working. So not all people have equal access to the basic necessities of food, shelter, water, or opportunities for life. And there may be these barriers that people have referred to, known as the social graces, age, ability, race, gender, and more. And so that in the therapy room, these issues need to be brought into the room when it's appropriate, when needed, in a collaborative way, which does justice and is respectful. The therapist may need to help actually access some of these resources to facilitate the meeting of these needs, which may be requiring you to go outside of the boundaries of the therapy room. And lastly, there's much more that I could say, but I think an ethical stance requires a therapist to utilize that knowledge they have in the public realm to promote justice. It isn't just enough to be in the therapy room and say, yes, it is unjust, but you have knowledge of how these policies and practices and narratives impact people's well-being. And so it behooves us to have a voice. So I'm really pleased that we have this book so that we can all work together to try to improve our practice. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anne. And I think I'm right in thinking that last on my list is Colin.
Just remember to release my microphone. Hi, everyone. Laura, I must confess, I obviously didn't pick up the message with your questions, or if I did, they've actually gone past my head. But certainly I'd thought about a few words to say. and I opened my chapter in the book with a quote, and I think it really captured me, and it continues to capture me. The quote was, "The essentials of life include whatever is necessary to take your place in public without shame." And I just found that so incredibly powerfully impactful. And it sent me off into many reflections, I think, throughout my life. But one of the things I thought about was that extraordinary book in 2009 by Wilkinson and Pickett called The Spirit Level, where they'd looked at research from all over the world, and consistently found that the more just societies there were, the more democratic there were, etc., had incredible consequences, the more equal they were in terms of status and so on. It affected trust between people, between strangers. It affected the lengths of prison sentences. It impacted teenage pregnancies, unwanted, etc., etc. It went on and on. It was an extraordinary book with a huge amount of presentation of research. And that whole context sensitivity, which I think we require as therapists, it just goes on being amplified. Just at the weekend, I happened to read that there's the United Nations envoy on poverty was recently critiquing our government in terms of noticing that the divisions between rich and poor have been amplified in the last 5 years since the previous report in 2017, I think, from his predecessor. And his predecessor also was saying, this is not good in the UK. You know, so in a way, we don't have to look far for huge range of evidences of oppression, discrimination on a whole range of different criteria. I suppose because I had this in mind, I was thinking about these things over the weekend. I happened to be looking through some documents on my computer and was quite relieved to see I was actually naming social injustice or social justice way back in about 2000, within something I'd written. And I've always been deeply concerned about inclusivity, equity, a concern for minoritized groups. And these are the following three definitions, almost names, are things that really struck me. Out of the gay rights movement a long time ago came the notion of oppression sickness. Cornel West, writing about African Americans in the States, talked about collective clinical depression. Lennox Thomas, writing out of the NAFCIAT Multicultural Therapy Centre in London, wrote about the collective combat fatigue of a group of Afro-Caribbean men that he was working with. And those kind of a combination somehow of mental health terms, but applied to groups, I again find very, very powerful. So my concern, I suppose, is for how we are context sensitive and how we continue to work on that, how it's probably a changing phenomenon in many ways. And so thinking about the challenges to therapists, and people have already begun to talk about these issues, the differing definitions of what is social justice and how do we all come at it from different perspectives. I also think a lot about, what are the ethics of our role as therapists, as practitioners? to what extent are we facilitating the exploration of clients, of their own lives, of their own frames of reference, and the extent to which how active we are in maybe confronting those views, going along with them, exploring them, and so on. And I think that's one huge area. And so another area that's always been important for me is to what extent can we be activists beyond the therapy room? You know, to what extent can we almost use the wisdom that sometimes comes from therapy, or those stories that in a way can be disseminated that actually have a political role? I'm mindful of time, but I think I'm a person of few words, and once I start, I get into it. But I went to see Chris Packham recently, stunning presentation. But he happened to just say one word, that he used to have a T-shirt that said, "If injustice rules, then rebellion is a duty." And I just find that extremely powerful. And finally, just over the weekend, I came across 2 or 3 different articles in The Guardian and the Colour Supplement. One talking about the value of talking to strangers. It reminded me of a whole thing that's going on in the moment at the moment in the States, where a man called Edward Rush is actually running empathy circles because of his anxiety about how different perceptions or different sets of political attitudes were polarizing society, and how people couldn't talk across those attitudinal divisions. So he's running something that he's now calling empathy circles. And of course, rooted in psychotherapy, we know that the term empathy goes back from, back through Rogers, and it goes right back through to Freud, etc., and how powerful that is. And I'm reminded of Rogers' work in large groups, in peace initiatives, and so on, and the importance actually of our capacity, it seems to me, to engage with facilitating those sorts of very complex conversations. And I think we have skills that we can bring to that. That's probably enough, but thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Colin. I wonder, John, I'll take your guide from you at this point, but I wonder whether it might be nice to kind of go back to offer to kind of give the contributors another moment in a second, just if they have anything they want to respond to. I can see Divine's got his hand up ready, and then maybe reserve the last kind of 10 minutes, 15 minutes for questions at the end, but give the contributors chance to respond to one another maybe, because I know as I was sat here listening, there was an awful lot kind of going through my mind. And one of the things that stood out for me was the points about reflexivity, and the fact that this book isn't just, it's not a book about the other. It's not a book about how to work with the distant other. It's a book about all of us as human beings. And the final thing to kind of I wanted to flag was Martin's point about this might not change what we do with everything. This isn't a new model of therapy we're putting forward. This is simply a way of viewing things and thinking about things that we've been talking about for quite a long time in various ways. Anyway, I'm going to shut up, but if that sounds like a grand plan, John, maybe we should go back firstly to Divine and then maybe to a few other people.
It does sound like a grand plan. Let's do that, Laura. And yeah, thank you for your comments too. Divine, over to you. Oh, we can't get you unmuted, it seems. Oh, there we go.
Thank you for unmuting me. Thank you. I think that's with the control tower. Yeah, I just wanted to say that I'm aware that it's important to bring social justice, informed therapy, and gender, and that Lynn Gabriel, who originally thought she might not be able to because she was teaching, did text me to say she might be here. So Lynn, if you are here, I just had wondered whether she wanted to say something about social justice, informed therapy, and gender before we move on. That's all. And Lynn, so sorry if I put you on the spot, but I think it's important now that you're here. You could say something.
And I'm just sending the unmute request to Lynn as well. Lynn, hopefully we can bring you on. Okay. There we go. Hi, Lynn. Hi.
Thanks, Divine. Yeah, I've just come out of a rowdy group of postgrad students lovely it was. So my apologies. I think I emailed Laura and Divine to say I would be landing late. But I caught some of the chapter contributors, and it's lovely to hear what people are saying. I've also been following the chat, some very interesting lines of discussion coming through in that. Gosh, Divine, what do I say? No, I hadn't nominated myself for doing a 3-minute bit, but what I am happy to say, however, is that I'll foreground this with, I do realize that the whole world of gender, transgender, is diverse, conflicted. There are very differentiated feelings, thoughts, beliefs, and takes. And just to foreground that the take I was taking in the chapter was from lived experience of working with a number of transgendered people and a number of people whose sexual gender identity rather was fluid, and a number, well, many individuals from the LGBT community. So I was definitely coming from a place of starting from where the client starts, really. So I'm not a pure person-centered practitioner, but something about the kind of accepting space, and also seeing some of the chat and some of the conversation about activism. I think it might have been Dwight who might have gone, but I think he put a comment in about it sits with the client, and if the work that we do with the client. So for example, a number of people that I've worked with, that we've worked with in the centre here, are struggling with transitions through various parts of their identity and their gender identity. And for me, it would be about the client's voice and the client's needs, and supporting them to identify those voices and needs, and to look at what they need to be doing on their own behalf. And some of that might be their own activism. So apologies if that sounds a bit rambling, and I realise I've probably travailed a lot of terrain, and I've just spotted Martin Milton, who's probably never going to remember me, but I was a huge fan of yours a number of years ago. Not quite the groupie, but definitely a big fan of your work. So lovely to see you here, really. So yeah, and I'll pause there, Divine. Just recognising it's a contested, rich, diverse arena, and the thing is to have debates and dialogue.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Lynn, and thank you, Divine, for pointing out that Lynn had come in. Divine, did you have any kind of reflections in response to anything that's been said so far? I realise the chat has been very active, but I haven't managed to keep up with any of it just yet. But maybe shortly we can turn to kind of questions and discussion as well.
Well, the chat has been active, and I've loved what the panelists and the authors have had to say. Now, because of the time, I think we'll probably have just over 10 minutes. I'm going to limit to what I could say, because I hope we'll have other forums for dialogue, and maybe go back to what you said, Laura and John, to put it back to the panel if colleagues want to respond to what others have said, or to respond to any of the questions that are in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Divine. Do any of our panelists have any kind of responses to anything that anyone else has said so far?
And everyone's got control over the mics. You can just hit that unmute button as one of the authors, and we should be able to hear you. Martin, I can see you waving. Let's see if we can get you unmuted. Great.
I wasn't surprised to see that in the chat. What kind of comes up, I think, is an anxiety that many people have, is that once we start talking about diverse positions and diverse context, we get into a kind of, how am I going to know it all? Have I got to prioritize this? Have I got to prioritize that? Or, but what if I don't know about this? Do I dump that and go there? And I think, and I haven't read them all yet, but you know, my quick glimpse through here is that none of these chapter seem to say, on this context, on this topic, one only does this particular prescribed thing. And knowing some of the colleagues, I'm expecting, but you could tell me I'm wrong, that actually what we're going to find is it's about attunement. It's about when the client comes in the room, we still have to find that client and hear from them. And so with one client, I may be called upon to do some research, to think critically, to find out what their position means for them in terms of gender or history or of all kinds of things. And none of that may be directly portable to the next client who walks in, where I may be faced with somebody from a very different position, and some of those issues don't feel relevant. And I think that's one of both the joys and the struggles of being the therapist, because we get called into these kind of binary political positions of, are you this or that, right or left? Do you debate different conversations? When actually in the moment, what I find myself doing is it's one of my frustrations with the profession in universities actually, is this kind of trying to be reductionistic and narrow things down, when actually what practice is like is, how do I best attune and how do I best work with? And so I think we're back to the art as well as the science, we're back to the autonomy as well as structures. And I think, yes, it can sometimes be overwhelmingly difficult and stressful, but actually that's one of the real joys of practice. And that's what I'm hoping people get if they spend some time looking at this, so that we can get to that point that Lynn was making about, actually, yes, it's dialogue, but we've got to find a non-binary, non-confrontational dialogue, rather than this anxiously based, I'm in this position, you must be in the other. Maybe that's my contribution for now.
That's really important and very useful, Martin. I think it speaks to some of what gets said in response. Mick, were you waiting to say something too?
I was kind of thinking about whether I should say something. I guess one thing that I'm thinking of, I'm very aware, for instance, we've got the elections coming up in a year or so's time. And like one of the questions I've been really thinking about, I don't know the answer to this one, and it relates a bit to what Martin was saying, is like, can you be an effective counsellor if you're really right wing? Like, say if you got really conservative, ultra conservative, racist views. I think probably the line is racism. I think if somebody's racist, I think it's pretty evident that they couldn't be working as a counsellor effectively, and that would be kind of breaching a whole series of ethical codes. But supposing somebody believes, like I was having this discussion with students yesterday, supposing someone takes the Suella Braverman line that living on the streets is a lifestyle choice. Is that okay for a counsellor to hold those views? And I think, going back to what Martin was saying, there's obviously nobody wants to kind of be prescribing and saying, you can be a counsellor, you can't be a counsellor. But at the same time, in terms of client safety, well-being, respect, things like prizing diversity, valuing difference, recognizing different cultural traditions, kind of acknowledging the role of prejudice and histories. Those things are kind of important, and I guess we've always been I think the counselling and psychotherapy communities have always kind of accepted they're important, but they've always been kind of on the edges. And I wonder how much they become central to the extent that we say these are essential competencies, the kind of competencies that kind of work in the book. It's still a bit on the margins. It's still, Colin knows that in our handbook of person-centered counselling, we've tried to put the chapter on difference and diversity. We always had it as kind of auxiliary professional issues, and now we put it right at the core in this third edition because it just feels so core. And I wonder if we are moving to a place where these competencies are core, but it raises issues. It raises issues about acceptance and valuing and seeing multiple positions. So I think it's complex.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I suppose it's good to hear that that's been moved in that regard. I think definitely not pushing some of this thinking to the sidelines is a useful kind of progression that we're making, but also definitely this kind of attunement about seeing what the client needs and meeting them there. I mean, one of the things that Divine and I talk about in our chapter is, or one of our chapters is that, you know, this isn't about telling people who to vote for. That's not what we're not saying. You start every therapy session and saying, this is who you have to vote for if you're my client, because that's certainly not what we're talking about. And it's also not about reducing everything to being about systemic oppressions, but it's an openness to factors beyond the individual as playing an important and significant role, even if, you know, that's not the focus of our work. I think you know, one of the things that we see, and we haven't talked about them as much, I think, because of the people we've got here, but one of the things we wanted to include in the book was this section around beyond the therapy room. And that's not to say that everybody is doing all of these things, but we wanted to include something on how we engage with advocacy, how we engage with influencing policy. But we're certainly not saying, you know, this is about telling people who to vote for, or about everybody must do these things at this point. Mariam, I've spotted you've got a hand up.
Yes, hi, thank you, Laura. I was just looking at some of the questions, and in particular a question that looked at the limitations of the intersectional approach, and I think it ended with whose model of society would we be looking to if there is stark differences in intersectionality between practitioner and client. And I think just going back to this sense of autonomy, if we're working with autonomy, that raises questions for me: is whose autonomy are you working with? Essentially, you're working with the client's autonomy, you're working with a client's frame of reference. So that's one way to kind of identify like the power differentials. As a therapist, as a practitioner, you will always hold the power, but it's the recognition that actually you're not imposing that power. If you're working with client autonomy, you're staying with your client's frame of reference, and you're encouraging the client to develop their autonomy. And I think, again, going back to my lovely chapter in the book, we talk about from a liberation psychology, this perspective on developing critical consciousness, and I'll just quote from that: critical consciousness is a process of developing deep consciousness and ability to recognize and analyze systems of inequality and a commitment to take actions against them. So therefore you're not imposing your own concepts of power or privilege. You're encouraging your client to develop critical consciousness and awareness so they can take action for themselves. And ultimately, that's empowerment through developing autonomy. That's all.
Brilliant, thank you. Divine.
Laura, I'm so pleased that we've got in the title power, politics, change. I think that absolutely nails it. But the bits I wanted to say is how much Western-based psychotherapy has struggled with critical theories that are on the margins, many of which hail from oppressed groups. Critical race theory, as an example. I recently wrote a chapter on critical race theory, and a colleague I was writing with, American colleague, said, Divine, the teaching of critical race theory has been banned in over 23 states. And how do you ban a theory that's supposed to be helping us to think? Now, that's not the only theory. There are other theories. So I think social justice and issues about power and who has the power is a dialogue we need to have. The second thing is talking to a colleague not so long ago who works with refugees, and they said, I now describe myself as a human rights therapist. And I think it's important to think about human rights and for us as therapists to take that position. And the very last thing I wanted to say is one of the things we decided to do alongside what Laura said is not to have a conclusion chapter, but to have a postscript. And so there's lots that the authors have put in the postscript, actually as to help us to begin the conversations. And I can see the chat exploding, and that's quite exciting. Thank you.
Thank you, Divine. Yes, I haven't at all kept up with the chat. The one thing I have seen that I can just respond to, because I think it's connected to what you just said, was the idea of kind of whose view of social justice we promote. And because I think that that connects with what you just said in terms of not having a conclusion and not having here's the kind of here's the end goal we're working towards. I think just as we all use many different therapeutic approaches, I think the same is kind of true in that respect. I'm aware we've only got 2 minutes left, John.
The time has gone so fast, hasn't it? Oh my goodness, yes.
How do we want to wrap this bit up at this point then? I know we've got the discount code that we need to share.
Yes, we do indeed. We've got the slide ready to go. There is a QR code on the slide, so if anybody's ready with mobile device, just to click that QR code. I've already tried it. I've got my discount set up. Maybe that's what we talk about. If anybody's wondering where that goes, it's just before the payment button. I was just having a look on the Sage website. So you put all your details in. It allows you to have free postage in the UK, which makes it almost £5 cheaper than it is on Amazon right today. So it's a very, very good deal. Yes. Yeah. 1 minute left, Laura. Anything else you might want to say? Or
I'm kind of frantically scrolling through the chat to see whether, because I realise I haven't really. I can see that authors have been responding, so I feel slightly reassured that somebody's been been looking at it more than I have. I can see the last point by Ben. Great, we can have some of these debates. Perhaps someone could host a wider debate for counsellors. That sounds like a great idea. Kind of taking
really
this conversation forward.
Oh, sorry, Laura. Yeah. I'm just noticing the diversity of views in the chat as well. There is a lot for us to talk about in our field, isn't it? And just so important, this book, that is really keeping that conversation going. Yeah, really keeping it on our agenda. Yeah.
Yes, lots of diverse perspectives. So apologies, I haven't been able to respond to people individually, but as I say, I'm glad other authors have been able to kind of chip in as we've been going.
Well, here we are up to time. It feels like we're just getting started. We could spend the rest of the week together, couldn't we, in these discussions? But I want to say thanks so much to the authors who could come along, make a contribution to this hour. Thanks to everybody as a group for kind of coming together and all the diverse opinions and philosophies we've been hearing. And Laura and Divine, thank you for holding this space and holding a space so that this book could come into the world. Very much appreciated. Yeah.